Right, you two lads, you can unmute yourselves. We're live now. We're it. That's it. The music is over. Tom, you unmute yourself well. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Theory with no Escher this week. I feel like we've been messing around too much with Escher's show. It's been like Thursday Theory on a Friday, and now it's Thursday Theory with no Escher. So let's see where this show goes next, right? No, anyway, seriously. Escher's taking a week off ill, so if you want to wish her get well soon or whatever, tag her in a tweet. But at the last minute, she literally told us 3 hours before we went on air, and we managed to get this show together. So credit to me. I'm going to credit Tom. Credit to me, Tom, and our guest Joe for getting this together at short notice, I guess. Well, we've got Joe filling in for Escher, Joe. So you've got to pretend you're like a historically, yeah, you got to pretend you're like a pro history podcaster with 40,000 likes or whatever.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So yeah, big boots to fill.
Well.
You'll do well. You'll do well.
Fine.
Exactly. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Anyway, Tom, hello. You made it at the last minute, as per usual.
I'm always on time, whether that be on time for the show starting or not is irrelevant.
It is, but I'm always like, all right, let's be in Discord 15 minutes before the show so we can get it all sorted and be on the same page. And at 9:26, I'm frantically calling you. There you go.
Yeah.
It won't be us, would it, if we didn't just throw this together at the last minute, right?
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get on to our actual point, I'm having a theory-based argument at the minute with an anarchist, right? So I think this is quite a good place to start, actually, because this anarchist is saying that Marx himself disagrees with the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat. So he was sent a quote which completely contradicted this point. The quote said, "We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralise all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organised as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible." And this anarchist replied to that saying, Marx changed his mind about this after the Paris Commune, which I thought was quite ridiculous, so I asked him for a source. He refused to provide one at first, so I said, no, I want a specific quote that contradicts the one you were given, please send a screenshot. And his quote was, from the first page of the manifesto, "The Germans number around 40 million. Will, for example, all 40 million be members of the government? Certainly, since this whole thing begins with the self-governance of the commune." Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I replied to that saying, so a national unity government led by the proletariat. Where have I heard that before? And I mean, I'm ratioing him on every single one of these tweets, and he actually replied to me saying, he's saying the government begins at the self-governed communal level. This has much more in common with libertarian communist modes of organisation than ML ones.
I mean, people have this weird habit, right, of just saying things. It's a very Western trait, right? One of my friends the other week sent me a picture of an argument that they'd be having, and it was about anti-Semitism, and they were like, the left is also right wing conspiracies always somehow lead back to Jewish people somehow, right? Yeah, and this guy had commented back saying, left wing ones do that too. Have you ever read the Communist Manifesto? Like that. And I'm seeing it and I'm like, yeah, that guy's literally not read it. One of the shortest books in existence. He's not read it. I'm pretty certain. I didn't want to say I was certain because I've not double checked yet, right? So I'm pretty certain that there's actually absolutely no mention of Jewish people in the Communist Manifesto, right?
Yeah.
So then I'm like, okay, I'll get the Communist Manifesto up, and thanks to the internet and technology, I just searched for the word no results. Do you know what I mean? No result. Have you read the Communist Manifesto? That's like, how are you going to say that in an argument to somebody when you've not read the book yourself? Like,
I mean, like, imagine sending me that quote, though, the one which clearly is talking about a dictatorship of the proletariat in all but name, and because it uses the word commune in it, and obviously commune in this context is referring to
the Paris Commune, right?
No. This is the quote he sent me. Says, hang on, sorry, I've gone off that idiotic argument. Now I'll get it back up. It says, all 40 million German people will be members of the commune, which to me implies, I think how Marx meant it, was that the commune will be the entire German state, the entire German nation of all 40 million people, and it will be guided by the proletariat. So therefore he's actually talking about a dictatorship of the proletariat. And this anarchist, like, no, it says commune, so it must mean,
it must mean Chaz or whatever.
Chaz, German Chaz. The
German state of Chaz. Carl had posted something the other day, didn't he, about he posted about Iran. There's gonna be a pipeline through Afghanistan. Carl was like, you do know that area is like mountainous, like they're not gonna build a pipeline up mountains down the other side. Like, it's impossible. Not tunneling through. And if they wanted to, they could have just gone through neighbouring Pakistan, right? This guy, just his opinion, he'd drawn like an MS Paint line on the map and was like, pipeline, see? It's just stupid. At least do the reading before you're going to open your mouth, because like you're only making yourself look stupid. You're not making me look stupid when you claim that like the Communist Manifesto is an anti-Semitic text. Like, it doesn't even mention Jewish people. Go on, Joe.
The thing is, though, it's just like if you look at like the media in this like country like that and in the West, you kind of just get rewarded for just saying shit. So it's kind of feel like it's just people internalize that, and then it's like, oh, I can just talk about something which like I've done no reading about. So that's why you listen to Mao when he says no investigation, no right to talk.
You see, Mao was clearly a red fash tanky though, so there's no point listening to him.
And I saw it. I mean, the media do this, don't they? They purposely do this. They'll put out an article with a headline, and then which is their opinion, and then straight after, sometimes in like the first bit of copy on that article, because they know 90% of people just share it and go, look at this scary headline, right? They'll debunk their own headline in the first article because they know that like they can't. The media, a lot of journalists are very sneaky, aren't they? Because they'll bend the truth rather than straight up lie. So they'll have a dodgy headline and then it'll be cleared up in the text somewhere, but you'll have to either read that far down the article or read between the lines, or they'll say stuff like the USSR locked up. Oh, something just fell over behind me. The USSR locked up this person, and then it'll say in the text allegedly. Do you know what I mean? Meaning that, or there was no record of the arrest, but according to, it'll be that the person who's claimed it. So it's almost like me just making something up. I mean, that's literally what it is. But because you've worded it in a certain way, it allows a certain part of that story to believe, right? Rather than the actual truth.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that's the main problem with debating with anarchists, Westerners.
I mean, debating with people in general.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. People don't do the reading and they think that they're in the know when really they're not, and you just make yourself look like an ass, really, don't you? You're not convinced anyone. Anyway, that point leads us nicely on to the topic of the show. I think that's why you brought that up originally, didn't you, Tom?
Yes.
Because if only... this show's called Thursday Theory, right? And we've not actually done any... It's usually been historical theory, isn't it? Imperialism, the history of imperialism. So let's do some theory while Eshy's not away. She'll be proud when she comes back that we've been doing our homework. But let's start right at the beginning and right at the simple stuff. Just because, why not, right? If only the anarchist had read this text. So we're going to be looking at the Principles of Communism by Friedrich Engels, right? This is kind of like the the pre-version of the Communist Manifesto, which was published 1847. So it's before Marx and Engels wrote the manifesto, which is more of a political sort of pamphlet. But it's the same principle, right? So should we just get right into it? Like, do you want to say anything, lads, before we get in?
I think. Sorry, go on, Joe.
No, I was going to say nothing.
Oh, right. I was going to say, I think this is actually a more effective work for brand new people on the left to read before they move into things like the manifesto. Because I remember when I first read the manifesto, I was about 15, something like that, and I didn't understand any of its meaning, right, because of how wordy the manifesto is, how many 1800s, 1900 words it tends to use, stuff like this, and I just didn't really get the concept, so I just like laughed at it and moved on. But if I'd read the Principles of Communism, I would have had a much better understanding of communism and what it means. So I think it's a fantastic starting point, the Principles.
And not only that, I think it's really good for when you are talking to somebody who themselves have not been introduced to this, right? Introduced to socialism, or they have some misconceptions on what socialism is and isn't, right? It's a very good piece of text to talk to your nan about in that aspect. Or any layman, your nan, your granddad, your workmate, whatever, point them to this. So let's just get straight into it, right? Are we gonna take it in turns and just discuss?
That seems to be the best thing.
All right, cool. If anybody,
the first 3 points we can read through and then discuss that after the first 3 anyway, because they're all relatively short, aren't they?
All right, but if any point you want to say anything, just butt in, and I'll do my best to moderate the show. Anyone in the chat has got anything else to add as well? Don't forget to drop your questions in the chat, and we'll read them out as well. So teamwork. I'll start. Number 1. What is communism? Right, this is very simple. Communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. Anything to add?
Not really. Fairly straightforward, that.
Who's going to do the next one?
I don't mind. The proletariat is the class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labour and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose will and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on demand for labour. Hence, on the changing state of business, on the vagrancies of unbridled competition, the proletariat, or the class or proletarians, is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century.
And continuing into this century as well now, right?
Yeah.
Everything here is still relevant to this day. You'll be reading it, and when I read this, I automatically tie it to things that have gone on now. I guess it's easier to relate that to the working class struggles of 18 whatever, but that just shows, doesn't it, that it's still relevant. Go on, Tom, next one.
Point 3. Proletarians, then, have not always existed? No, there have always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor, but there have not always been workers and poor people living under the conditions as they are in today. In other words, there have not always been proletarians any more than there has always been free, unbridled competitions.
Right, okay, well, let's just carry on. This is something that we discussed on Friday's show last week, but I'll read it out again. Number 4, how did the proletariat originate? The proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the last half of the 18th century, and which has since then been repeated in all the civilized countries of the world. This Industrial Revolution was precipitated by the discovery of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the mechanical loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and hence could only be bought by big capitalists, altered the whole mode of production and displaced the former workers because the machines turned out cheaper and better commodities than the workers could produce with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms. The machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered entirely worthless the meagre property of the workers, tools, looms, etc. The result was that the capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory system into the textile industry. Now, I just want to interject a little bit there, because capitalism itself predates the proletariat as a class, right? But it's the industrialization of labour that creates the proletariat, right? Because Britain was capitalist for at least 100 years before this took place.
Yeah.
Right, I'll carry on.
Well, I suppose you could just say that the class of the bourgeoisie existed before the class of the proletarians, because the proletarians brought about by a very specific condition, which is what you've just read. Whereas the bourgeoisie have always been, they kind of evolved from like the aristocratic landed class.
Exactly. Feudalism created the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie created the proletariat, right?
Yeah. But
they are both the antagonistic class group to the former, aren't they? The latter is the bourgeoisie, the merchant, is the antagonistic class to the feudalist. So the feudalist wants to do all he can to suppress the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie do all they can to oppress the proletariat, which is the antagonistic class to them. Anyway, let's carry on. Once the impulse of the introduction of machinery and factory system has been given, the system spread quickly to all other branches of industry, especially cloth and book printing, pottery, and the metal industries. Obviously, this is 1847, so just carry that timeline on if you're analysing this, just all the way to semiconductors. Labour was more and more divided amongst the individual workers, so that the worker who'd previously done a complete piece of work now only did part of that piece. That's the changing from like a, what's the word?
It's division of the division of labour. So you.
No. What's the word like before? What's the word for somebody like a?
Predates.
Artisan.
Artisan. There you go. Yeah. Like an artisan worker who would do the whole job himself, a stonemason sort of thing, rather than under the Industrial Revolution turns stonemasonry into a production line, doesn't it? Rather than a single job done by one artisan worker.
And don't forget as well that it's interesting, I don't know about you guys, but when I was in school we were always taught about the Industrial Revolution from like a kind of positive perspective. It was never heard the term proletarian or anything like that, but a lot of it was put down to the creation of production lines and the division of labour changing, and they were like, oh, this is a good thing for the working class as a whole because they didn't have to do all the whole job and all this. But in reality it was one of the conditions that led to the oppression of the proletariat, I suppose is the best way of putting it, by the destruction of artisanal classes and stuff like that.
Put it this way, right? I went to a tourist spot the other day, right, and it was a cave, but the cave entrance used to have an artisan rope making business there because the cave mouth was really open and it was dry. So artisan rope makers, to make rope for mines, would make their rope in this cave, right? Because that's the only place on earth that you could keep the rope dry, because as soon as the rope gets wet it rots. The mine doesn't want to buy a rotten rope, so it's just not possible to do it outside. Anyway, it was done in this cave, and it was done in the cave for like 300 years by like one family who all worked out of one cottage, and then the Industrial Revolution comes along and now rope is made, like you just said then, on a production line where the resources are. This is where imperialism starts coming in, isn't it? When instead of getting the rope fibers from the local sheep or whatever, they're now importing it from the cheapest place on earth where they can get this fiber, shipping it halfway across the world to a factory. It's unloaded by this guy. That's the division of labour, isn't it, that the Industrial Revolution created. And in that, it took the industry of rope making, pottery, bookmaking, all these blacksmithing, and it took it out of the hands of the artisan, and in creating the proletariat class, in the fact that the production line had to be manned by the least skilled that the capitalist would allow, because they want that, don't they?
What you just said there is really poignant, because obviously you can kind of have, let's say, 10 people in this rope making production line, and not one of them needs to know how to create a full rope, but as long as they know how to do the specific 10th of the rope making that they've been taught to do, it's a lot easier for the capitalist to educate those 10 jobs, whether that be 10 various different stages, and
it protects his business interest as well.
Exactly, that's what I'm getting at. Obviously, it prevents the rope makers from going, all right, well, we'll just go and make our own ropes because we know how to do it now because you've taught us how to do it. They don't know how to do it because they only know how to do a tenth of the process because that's what they've been taught, and obviously that keeps the labour cheap and prevents them from having competition of any kind. The capitalist, I mean,
maximizes profit, prevents competition. And like you say, they know exactly what you're talking about because the industry before them, before the Industrial Revolution, was exactly that. They smashed apart those workers that would go, no, my rope made in my dry cave is the best, and we're an artisan family that have been doing it for ages, and nobody else can come in and smash it apart, right? So they know it's coming. Anyway, I'm going to carry on. This division of labour made it possible to produce things faster and cheaper. It reduced the activity of the individual worker to simple, endlessly repeated mechanical motions which could be performed not only as well, but much better by a machine as well. In this way, all these industries fell, one after another, under the dominance of steam machinery and the factory system, just as spinning and weaving had already done. But at the same time, they also fell into the hands of big capitalists, and their workers were deprived of whatever independence remains to them. Gradually, not only genuine manufacture, but also handicrafts came within the province of the factory system, as big capitalists increasingly displaced the small master craftsmen. That's what I was looking for. Small master craftsmen, by setting up huge workshops which saved many expenses and permitted an elaborate division of labour, just like we've talked about then. You know, the small family rope makers that needed that cave to do it. So a big industrial capitalist who can now just build a factory and fill it with the kids of the village, right? And compete with them, make rope cheaper, and push that small master craftsman business just into the dust through being able to offer a cheaper product.
And at more capacity as well, because obviously if a single family of artisanal rope makers are going to be able to make, say, 5 ropes a week maybe, whereas the capitalist will be able to produce 250, and not only that, but also at a cheaper rate. So no one's going to go and buy the artisanal rope because there's no point, there's no reason to do that.
Exactly. This is how it has come about in civilised countries. At present time, nearly all kinds of labour are performed in factories, and in nearly all branches of work, handicrafts and manufacture have been superseded. This process has, to an ever greater degree, ruined the old middle class, especially the small handicraftsmen. It has entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and the 2 new classes have been created, which are gradually swallowing up all the others. These are the class of the big capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already in almost exclusive possession of all the means of subsistence and of the instruments, machines, factories, etc., and the materials necessary for the production of the means of subsistence. This is the bourgeois class, or the bourgeoisie. And 2, the class of the wholly propertyless, who are obliged to sell their labour to the bourgeoisie in order to get in exchange the means of subsistence for their support. This is called the class of proletarians, or the proletariat.
I think a good point there is the Chinese word for proletarian is wu chanzhe, which means literally one who is without property. That's literally what it translates to. And I always like looking at like Chinese translations of terms like this, because proletarian, we know what it means because we've studied the ideas and we kind of fully understand it. But the context of Chinese makes things very simple. They have to put it into simple words in order for it to kind of, you know, not be dead wordy and fit into a sentence. So one without property is a good way of kind of classifying what the proletariat are. Without
the class of the wholly propertyless.
Yeah.
That's how Engels puts it.
I think it's really important, this part here, because a lot of the times when you hear people like talking about, I know, socialism, whatever, or we're talking about working class in general, it's not, they don't see it from like a Marxist perspective, where it's kind of like, you know, it's about relation to capital, and like you have to sell your labor, so you have to work. It's more kind of like an income-based thing, and we're like, oh, you got like a certain amount of income, that means you're not working class, you are working class. It's about relation to capital, and that's the kind of where a lot of people have a fundamental like misunderstanding of it, and it's very important, this part, because I had that misunderstanding for a while.
I think as well, one final point to put on here is when it says property. I mean, obviously we don't really need to explain this to our audience, but for people that might be coming and listening along, people that are new, it doesn't mean obviously all kinds of property, but it's referring to obviously the artisanal rope maker. Back to that good example. I can't believe how much examples that's given us, Fran. Very good shout. But basically, the artisanal rope maker would have had property in terms of the tools necessary to create the rope.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the spinning jennies, looms, things like this. Small ones before the kind of invention of more high tech.
The cart that he uses to go and get the sheep fibers from down the hill, you know, the house that he lives in the cave, the actual rope making equipment.
These is what the property we're talking about.
The means of production, right?
Yes. Because I think people hear means of production and they think that means factories, which yes, factories are a means of production, but it also goes down to the lowest kind of level, which is the means of production can be, as you say, sheep shearing tools and you know wheelbarrows, things like this, in the context of what that worker's doing.
Well, it's literally goes further than that, doesn't it? Because you could describe it as literal, like, human thought, and people's hands are the means of production. It doesn't have to be a tool. It's the act of going to work, isn't it? And the things that you use to do that, to produce something. That's the difference. The difference between, I mean, it's so simple to work out, isn't it? When you're not talking to somebody who's adamant that they're not going to understand it, right? Mm-hmm. Me and you could be propertyless, right? And we could have to go to Joe's factory to earn our bread for the day. It's literally that. Joe's the capitalist. We're the propertyless. We have to go to his factory. You know, it's that simple. Right, Joe, next one. Number 5.
Under what conditions does the sale of labour of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place? Labour is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to other commodities. In the regime of big industry or free competition, as we shall see, the two come to the same thing. The price of commodity is, the average, is equal to the cost of production. Hence, the price of labour is also equal to the cost of production of labour. But the cost of production of labour consists of precisely the quantity of meat of substance necessary to enable the worker to continue working and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more from his labour than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labour, or the wage, will, in other words, be the lowest minimum required for the maintenance of life. However, since this business is sometimes better and sometimes worse, follows that the worker sometimes get more and sometimes less for his commodities. But again, just as the industrialist, on average of good times and bad, gets no more or less for his commodity than what they cost. Similarly, on the average, the worker gets no more and no less than his minimum. Mm-hmm. The economic law of wages operate strictly the greater the degree of which big industry has taken possession of all branches of production.
Yes. And I mean, I know that sounds confusing, what you just read, but to put it simply, just think of the concept of how people are paid under capitalism. It's called the minimum wage, isn't it? They're not lying. They're literally, we've got to pay people the minimum wage. Have you noticed how the majority of people are on the minimum wage? Like what this sentence is talking about is, the capitalist will never pay the worker more than what he thinks he has to, right? Sometimes he might pay them more because he might feel that if I pay him more, he'll produce more for me, or I'll be able to keep him on side over some other worker, or if I pay my staff more, they'll not join the strike that's happening down the road. But most of the time, they're getting the minimum. Well, I mean, even in those times, they're still getting the minimum that the capitalist is willing to pay them, right? That's what this is saying.
I think it's also interesting to note, because I say it's relatively complex from an economic standpoint, but if under socialism the means of production become communally owned by the proletariat, then this law still works. Obviously sometimes the worker under socialism will be paid more or less depending on how much in demand the product the worker makes is. But under capitalism, this is artificial, isn't it? Because the worker will often be paid the same amount, but that will be the minimum amount that is possible. That, as you say, it's the minimum wage. So what I'm getting at is, like, obviously, if everyone had the full fruits of their labor, the full price of their working power, it would fluctuate in the same way the capitalist's income fluctuates. They never have a steady wage.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
selling
Well,
products.
that would be to the wills of what value people have put on that item, right?
Yeah, but the workers' wage, even when it was fluctuating, would always be higher than the minimum that they were getting paid under capitalism.
Well, of course,
because there's no profit extraction. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. The surplus value has not been stolen by Jeff Bezos. Like, how did Jeff Bezos get $1 billion? You can't physically get to $1 billion, can you, without exploiting somebody's labor? And it's this this core principle, isn't it, that's why Jeff Bezos is sat with $1 billion in his back pocket and been to space. Right, do the next one, 6. Joe, have you got anything you want to say at the end of that?
No, not particularly.
You were just saying exactly where?
Yeah, just...
Nice.
Yeah.
Right, okay, Tom, here you go. Number 6.
What working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution? The working classes have always, according to the different stages of development of society, lived in different circumstances and had different relations to the owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the workers were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backwards countries and even in the southern part of the United States. So this is how old this book is. It was written when, slavery was still a thing in the USA. I know it's still a thing now. I'm not saying it's been abolished.
Well, it's talking about chattel slavery, right?
Yeah.
This is talking about black slavery, I think.
Yeah, chattel slavery.
Yeah. In the Middle Ages, they were the serfs of the land-owning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland, and Russia. In the Middle Ages, and indeed right up to the Industrial Revolution, there were also journeymen, which is another word for artisans, in the cities who worked in the service of the petty bourgeois masters. Gradually, as manufacture developed, these journeymen became manufacturing workers who were even then employed by larger capitalists.
Right, okay, that journeyman thing is like back in medieval Europe, fetch me the finest swordsmith in etc., right? It's that idea. Do you get what I'm saying? They go get the journeyman sword maker who will come and make a sword for whoever's requested it, and then he'll move on to the next. Because obviously that's it, is his artisan handcraft. That's how things got made under feudalism. You have these big production lines.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when you talk about a country's material conditions today, the vast majority of countries, not all of them, but the vast majority still operate under a kind of like a capitalist structure, whereby the owning ruling class is the bourgeoisie, and then they have proletariat, which they oppress. But that's not always been the case. Like when we refer to China, pre-revolution China, as feudal, we mean that there was literally still the example of feudalism. There was still the serfs. There were still slaves in some part of the country as well. And this is why Mao found it so difficult to kind of develop revolution from the proletariat, because the proletariat
same for Lenin, right?
Yes, the same for Lenin. But I think it more marked under Mao, because obviously.
Well, Russia was a little bit ahead in its terms of capital. Well, I guess they both had about the same time. Capitalism started in China, with the Republic?
Yes.
Feudalism was on the way out, wasn't it? But a lot of China...
I don't know, though, because you got to remember when Mao went into Tibet in 1956, that was still entirely feudal. Like the entire area.
Yeah, just different areas were, right? But
I think it's to the size of the country.
They both had about the same. Capitalism developed slower, I'd say, in China, but definitely along the coast it was there, right? In the
Republic. all the foreign-owned factories. Sorry, Joe, go on.
I mean, China had the kind of problem with, Western powers, kind of, with imperialism, where Russia was less of a problem.
Because...
Well, Russia was an imperial state, whereas China was an imperialized state at this point in time, as you say. And as Fran said, it was along the coastlines. That was where all the foreign concessions were. So all the means of production were owned by foreign capitalists as opposed to domestic capitalists, which is why Mao was so easily able to ally with the national bourgeoisie of his country alongside the working classes and the peasant classes, because the national bourgeoisie wanted the ability to be the bourgeoisie of their own country, which they couldn't be because they were oppressed. Get me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, next one, number 7, because this is going to answer these questions that we're sort of bringing up now. Yeah, I'm going to read it out. In number 7, in what way do the proletarians differ from slaves? The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, his property of one master, is assured an existence, however miserable it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, property, as it were, of the entire bourgeois class, which buys his labour only when someone has need of it. He has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the class as a whole. The slave is outside competition. The proletarian is in it and experiences all its vagaries. The slave counts as a thing, not as a member of society. Thus, the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, while the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher social level than the slave. The slave frees himself when, of all the relations of private property, he abolishes only the relation of slavery and thereby becomes a proletarian. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing private property in general, right? And I don't want people to get confused with that and think that Engels is saying that proletarians suffer worse than slavery, but it's just describing the connection to the whole society, right?
I think
which is true. Go on. No, I was just say it's true.
I was going to say, it goes into the needs and interests of the owning class, doesn't it? The owner of the slave, as Engels says there, it's within his interest to keep the slave alive, because he's bought that slave as an object, as a thing, rather than as a person, and thereby, if he keeps his slaves fed well, they're going to be able to do more work. If he keeps his slaves, occupied with work and other forms of occupation, they're less likely to rise up. So basically, having a slave, although the existence is meager and poor, as Engels says, they are guaranteed food and a house or a roof, somewhere to sleep. These things that are required for human life to keep the slave alive, purely in the interest of the owner. Whereas for a proletarian, it doesn't matter to the bourgeoisie, the owner in this context, if that individual proletarian dies, because the proletariat will
provide another one.
Is so huge, it will instantly provide them another one, and it will be at no difference in cost to them, because they're just paying a different person rather than
exactly. They don't have to travel to a slave market, buy a new slave, whatever. They just get somebody else in. Right. Okay.
Also, I don't know if I had to quickly go out for a second, but it's interesting with Adam Smith. He argued that basically slavery, what kind of it should be abolished, but it's basically why slavery became outdated is because if you only have to pay a slave, if you have to guarantee all their existence, it's a lot more cost to the slave owner than just paying them a bad wage. So a lot of the times after slavery ended, I mean, especially in the South, when they became crop farmers, not kind of they were still staying on the same plantation, but they'll, instead of being guaranteed certain things, they're getting a wage as they're becoming proletariat instead, where they were. And in that situation, their living conditions got worse, which is because you don't have to guarantee healthcare, because they just kind of think we can easily replace it, not as an investment, which is pretty. Up by...
and I mean, if you struggle to understand this concept, just the abolition of slavery wasn't really affected by. I mean, proletarians took part in workers' struggles, influenced, refusing to touch cotton from slave plantations, etc., in factories. But the battleground, in terms of, say, things like the American Civil War or whatever, they are literally bourgeois on bourgeois wars. You have the slaver class versus the big capitalist class, that sees that there's more profit in proletarianizing society. Their interest. What I'm trying to get at, Joe, first before you come in, is that George Washington, etc. They weren't trying to. Not George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. Sorry, they weren't trying to abolish slavery, the North, because they were nice people, right? It's because their economic interest. It served it better to actually do that, right?
But there's also it's very important to say that there were slaves that did rebel.
Oh, of course.
It's very, it's just important to mention that I think, it's a lot because how brutal it's not saying that, it's just how brutal chattel slavery was, that there was huge resistance against it in slaves, and that's the main reason why slavery was abolished. But I agree with what you're saying, obviously, that it was
well, those sort of examples like you're mentioning are the reasoning why a capitalist would want to abolish it, right? Because it cuts that out. This is what I'm saying, when there is a capitalist interest in doing that as well, because look, getting rid of slavery, replacing slavery with a proletarialized worker, like you just said. So now the freed slave is just coming and collecting a wage every day, and you can knock down all the housing you had before and turn it to an even bigger plantation. And then you also get them to work a machine that does the job they used to do, right? And you make even more money. What we're talking about morals don't come into it. It's just sheer economic interests for the capitalist class. That's why liberals will get tricked into thinking that they have the greater interest of humanity at heart, haven't they? They still do it to this day, going on about climate change whilst polluting, because it's in their economic interest to just not fix their waste management problems, whatever. The capitalist class have done this sort of stuff then and continue to now, because the search for profit is illogical and immoral, right? Right. Next one.
I think just to add on to what you were saying there, if you look at the battlegrounds of the kind of American Civil War, the North was highly industrialized, which was why there was a burgeoning proletariat being born there, and that's why you've got that economic interest. Now, at the same time, Britain was trading with the Confederacy, the slave-owning states, which were all mainly breadbasket kind of areas. They were mostly just large plantations and agrarian farmland, which wasn't so prevalent in the North. Now, Britain had abolished slavery prior to the American Civil War. Abolished slavery in their own country, and thereby they were kind of whereas it was within the interests of the American bourgeoisie to fight amongst itself in order to kind of centralize control and try and create the proletarian class all throughout the country, even at the expense of these slave owners, Britain was still getting the cheap cotton, and it didn't give a shit how it was getting it, because obviously Britain was an imperial nation. So that's why they were so happy to trade with slave owners, even though they themselves had abolished slavery. And that's what you mean when you say morals doesn't come into it. Britain didn't abolish slavery because morally it was the right thing to do. They abolished slavery because
they saw a bottom line one day.
Well, it was easier for them to get their slave products from abroad as well, and therefore you're never going to have to deal with domestic slave revolts, as Joe was saying, because there are no slaves, there's no one to revolt. You only have to deal with proletarian revolution at this stage of the game. Whereas the Americans, they were worried about slave revolts, of course they were, so that factored into the decision to abolish it. But obviously that wouldn't have mattered. Americans probably would have still bought slave labor from, well, they do today. You still got Americans buying slave labor from the likes of African countries,
their own country
to a lesser extent. But I mean, in terms of the way they get their products cheapest, they will trade in slave states, and this is purely imperial economics, isn't it?
Nestle, for example, they still use slaves to pick kids to pick chocolate, but because it's not white kids, it doesn't matter, does it? It's not white Western kids. This is what we're talking about. Right, number 8. In what way do proletarians differ from serfs? Who's this? Is this Tom or Joe?
Joe.
All right. The serf possesses and uses an instrument of production, a piece of land, in exchange for what he gives up part of his product or part of the service of his labour. The proletarian works for the instruments of production of another on account of this other in exchange for a part of the product. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. The serf has an assured existence, the proletarian has not. The serf is outside competition, the proletarian is in it. The serf liberates himself in one of three ways. Either he runs away to the city and there becomes a handicraftsman, or instead of products and services, he gives money to the lord and thereby tenant, and he overthrows his feudal lord and himself becomes property owner. In short, by one route or another, he gets into owning class and enters into competition. The proletariat liberates himself by abolishing competition, private property, and all class differences.
This is interesting, isn't it? Because I think this is why you often hear slavery and serfdom being compared, and you often hear serfs being referred to as slaves. And although it's not ideally correct assertion, it's more correct than saying the proletariat is a slave, because if you look at the comparisons between the serf and the proletariat and the slave and the proletariat, it's very similar. In terms of the existence being guaranteed, generally for a one-off price, whether that be the price of the slave or the price of the piece of land that the serf works. The serf gives up, the proletarian receives. Again, that's the same situation you've got with slaves. And the proletarian works with the instruments of production of another and for the account of another in exchange for part of their product, which obviously neither the serf nor the slave does. So there's more comparisons between the serf and the slave than there are between either of those two classes and the proletariat directly.
Right, let's carry on.
Okay. In which way do the proletarians differ from handicraftsmen, so artisans, journeymen, etc.? In contrast to the proletarian, the so-called handicraftsman, as he still existed almost everywhere in the past (18th century), and still exists here and there at present, is a proletarian at most temporarily. His goal is to acquire capital himself, wherewith to exploit other workers. He can often achieve this goal where guilds still exist or where freedom from guild restrictions has not yet led to the introduction of factory-style methods into the crafts, nor yet to fierce competition. As soon as the factory system has been introduced into the crafts and the competition flourishes fully, this perspective dwindles away and the handicraftsman becomes more and more a proletarian. The handicraftsman therefore frees himself by becoming either bourgeois or entering the middle class in general, or by becoming a proletarian because of competition, as is now more often the case, in which case he can free himself by joining the proletarian movement, i.e. the more or less communist movement.
Simple, really, that, isn't it?
It's fairly straightforward, I think. I think as well, this kind of factors into what is a petty bourgeois versus what is a regular bourgeois, because you often see these terms being used incorrectly, don't you? And I think with regards to a petty bourgeois, this would be somebody like a handicraftsman who has acquired enough capital to maybe own their own workshop and hire 4 or 5 people, or in the modern sense, more like a restaurant owner who owns only one restaurant and it hires maybe 20 people.
Small capitalist.
Say again?
Small capitalist. 99.9% of human capitalists.
And then the larger capitalist is simply somebody who would own a chain of those crafts.
Nestle, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, Facebook, whatever. Yeah. Somebody with a monopoly. Yeah. The local restaurant doesn't have a monopoly. I mean, they might do, I guess, if they're on that. I mean, like McDonald's. Oh, they would just be yeah, exactly. It's about who controls the monopoly, doesn't it?
It's where you've got like the McDonald's, where, for example, that is certainly whoever owns that today is a big capitalist. Whereas somebody who owns a little mum and pop restaurant or whatever, they are still a capitalist because they own capital and they hire workers and they own the means of production. So therefore, that's the differentiation you've got to make as well. Next point.
In what way the proletarians differ from manufacturing workers? The manufacturing worker of the 16th to the 18th centuries still had, but with few exception, an instrument of production in his own possession. His loom, the family spinning wheel, a little plot of land that he cultivated in his spare time. The proletarian has none of these things. The manufacturing worker almost always lives in the countryside and in more or less patriarchal relation to his landlord or employer. The proletarian lives for the most part in a city, and his relation to his employer is purely a cash relation. The manufacturing worker is torn out of his patriarchal relation by big industry, loses whatever property he still has, and in this way becomes a proletarian. Right, that's the death of the rope maker, isn't it? Described in this one.
Mm-hmm.
They're the manufacturing worker whose business has been torn out by big industry, big capitalism. So either, like the point above, they go and become part of the bourgeois with whatever they've got left and try and become a capitalist, or they become, like everybody else, at behest to selling their labour power for a wage, right? There's another good point in this one that I want to make. This one really does fit the time, doesn't it, of the 1800s, because this is written before the USSR was around, right? So workers have a little bit more than what Engels is describing in this one, I think, these days. So this one is a little bit out of date, but it still applies on like a conceptual level, I think, because proletarians do have the ability to start an Etsy account, or have a plot of land where they can grow your own veg, or start your own small business, right? They can do that in this day and age, and that's because the capitalist class have realised that they're no competition to their existence, if not help it to exist, right? Because then
it's no threat. It's
exactly
all a threat, isn't it?
Yeah. So this one's a little bit out of date, but certainly in terms of like 1800s, is correct, isn't it? Because this is what we're talking about in comparing a slave to a proletarian, right? So a serf/slave in medieval England, right, that's been forced to build the castle for his lord, is being forced to build a castle for his lord for no wage, right? But at least he's got a bed to sleep in at night, and at least he's going to get a bowl of gruel because his boss knows that he's got to keep him working and fed. He'll give him the minimum amount, and he's got a shit life still, right? But the difference between that and a Victorian worker in London in the late 1800s, say like Jack the Ripper times, where we've talked about this before, where workers in London are having to earn 4p to live in a workhouse, which is literally a communal lodging, they were called, or something, and it's literally just like a house where proletarian workers, or anyone that didn't have their own house to stay in, that didn't have enough, weren't making enough money to afford to rent somewhere proper, they would stay in these like work houses, the workhouse, right? Similar to that, but not the workhouse, one where you would pay every day. But people would have to earn the 4p to go and get a bed, which was literally just line by line in a big room. You just slept next to each other with other people, and if you didn't earn that 4p, you would be kicked out onto the street, and your boss that you've worked for, if you've even got a boss and you're not just like prostituting or whatever, is not going to help you, are they? They don't care, because if there's plenty of other proletarians all trying to get their 4p for their place to sleep under a roof, right? That's the relationship, the comparison that we're talking about. It's not a defense of the practices, is it? It's just an analysis of the economic relationship.
Yeah,
exactly. Go on, Tom, what were you saying?
I was going to say as well, I think when it comes to this kind of situation, this is why a capitalist will always purposefully create unemployment, so that you've always got a...
Yeah, exactly. A surplus of labour. Exactly. It's that principle.
And then
A
obviously
slave owner doesn't have a surplus of slaves, does he? Work that he keeps
Exactly.
like off-site, so when one dies, he can just bring one in. He's got to go and buy another one. He doesn't keep a surplus of them. It's just a different economic relationship to the divisions of labour, isn't it? That's what it is.
Mhm.
And there's also, I mean, kind of just like going back from like first point, but like it's I don't know how violent the actual transition is between like going from all the industrial revolution in general, which I think is important to point out, because like if you look at how like how you make a person who's like normally quite content with like a small little farm, like which they had before. In England's a good example, but because that's one I know better. But in England, I mean, like 1400s, whatever, you have your small little plot of land, and you're kind of a serf where you send money to your local lord, whatever. But then they did a communal land where everyone would be able to live off the land, and then you'd live like by yourself, where you'd be self-sufficient. But then the whole land enclosures where they'll like violently kick off everyone just so they can make space for sheep farming, and so that the workers will then become, they would have nowhere. They would have to get rid of the capital so that they have to become dependent on the capital from like capitalists. So there's a very violent. It's not just kind of like a peaceful, like, suddenly there came a factory and suddenly all the workers like had to go to the factory. They chose to go to the factory. It was a violent transition between the next.
I think as well, one other good point to mention, based on what you just said there, made me think of this. Both the slave owning class and the serf owning class have to have a monopoly upon violence to keep control over their subjects. So in regards to a slave, obviously, you saw lynchings of slaves, you saw whippings, you saw all these various kind of violent methods to keep the slave in control. So under control, sorry. With serfs, if you didn't pay your feudal landlord, he would just send a group of like knights to come and burn your fields down, and then you starve to death because you've got nothing to eat then. So it's within your interests in both situations to work, so you don't get beatings as a slave or worse, lynched, and so that you don't get your land torched as a serf, for example. Whereas the violence of capitalism is not direct. Very rarely is it to the in this period of time, you wouldn't get too much whippings or anything like that done to the individual worker in a factory, because it didn't make sense to do that, because the wage labor, the wage slavery as it's sometimes referred to, in itself keeps the worker in line, because they know that if they don't work they're going to starve, right? So it's this lack of
Get rid of.
you don't need to threaten the worker because the threat is implicit.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Right. Who's on this one? It's a long one. Do you want me to do this one?
That's right.
On then.
What were the immediate consequences of the Industrial Revolution and the division of society into bourgeois and proletariat? First, the lower prices of industrial products brought about by machine labor totally destroyed, in all countries of the world, old systems of manufacture or industry based upon hand labor. In this way, all semi-barbarian countries, which had hitherto been more or less strangers to historical development, and whose industry had been based on manufacture, were violently forced out of their isolation. They brought cheaper commodities out of England and allowed their own manufacturing workers to be ruined. Countries which had known no progress for thousands of years, for example India, thoroughly revolutionized, and even is now on the way to a revolution. And even China is now on the way to a revolution. Sorry, we had come to the point where a new machine invented in England deprives millions of Chinese workers of their livelihood within a year's time. In this way, big industry has brought all the people of the earth into contact with each other, had merged all local markets into one market, had spread civilization and progress everywhere, and had thus ensured that whatever happens in civilized countries will have repercussions in all other countries. It follows that if workers in England now liberate themselves, they must set off revolutions in countries. Revolutions which sooner or later must accomplish the liberations of their own respective working class. Second, wherever big industries displaced manufacture, bourgeoisie developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The result was whatever this happened. The bourgeoisie took political power into its own hands and displaced the hitherto ruling class. The aristocracy, the guild-minded masters, and their representative, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeoisie annihilated the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entailment of the estates. In other words, by making landed property subject to purchase and sale, and doing away with special privileges of the nobility. It destroyed the power of guild masters by establishing guilds and handicraft villages. In their place, it put competition, that is, a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being the lack of necessary capital.
Right, let me just stop you there. Let me just stop you there for a minute, because that last, let's just have a discussion here before we carry this on, because this is a big one. This last paragraph, for me, explains how the British monarchy, and I know it's similar in other constitutional monarchies. Now, I know he gets onto this in a little bit later down, so just carry on reading and I'll stop you again when we get there.
The introduction of free competition is thus public declaration that from now on the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal. That the capital is the decisive power, and therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. Free competition is necessary for the establishment of big industry because it's the only condition of society in which big industry can make its way. Having destroyed the social power of the nobility and the guild masters, the bourgeoisie also destroyed their political power. Having raised itself to the actual position of first class in society, it proclaims itself to be also the dominant political class. This it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and recognition of free competition, and in European countries take the form of constitutional monarchy. In these constitutional monarchies, only those who possess a certain capital are voters, that is to say, only members of the bourgeoisie. Those bourgeois voters choose the deputies, and the bourgeois deputies, by using their right to vote, the right to refuse to vote taxes, choose a bourgeois government.
Okay, stop there. Right, so this sentence here, this last paragraph that you've talked about, the concept of European constitutional monarchy and the way that, I mean, look at what it says here. It says, firstly, the bourgeois also having destroyed the social power of the nobility and the guildmasters, the bourgeois also destroyed their political power. So that's the bourgeois revolution. Having raised itself to the actual position of the first class in society, it proclaims itself to be also the dominant political class. It does this through the introduction of a representative system which rests on bourgeois equality before the law, right? And, this is the key point, recognition of free competition. That's the UK Parliament's relationship to the British monarch, isn't it? Summed up perfectly. I mean, we've talked about it on Esh's show weeks ago, the rituals that they do in the British Parliament. I mean, like, the Queen is not allowed to enter the House of Commons, is she? Because the House of Commons isn't for the aristocracy. So she's not actually allowed in there. So she has to send a representative to ask MPs, the bourgeois class, to come to speak to them in the House of Lords, right? So they physically bar her from the room. Like, if that's not as much of a symbol of the class, which class is subservient to the other, then you're not going to get a clear one. And also, I was having this discussion with somebody else the other week, and they were saying that, like, the royal family are capitalists because they carry out capitalism, right? An example of that is Prince Charles. A raw example. I mean, they do far much more than this, but Prince Charles has a company growing vegetables, right, for British supermarket chains. So you can buy, like, carrots grown in Prince Charles's land because he's got a carrot growing business. But that in itself is a descriptor of this power relationship, isn't it? Because before capitalism came around, land was owned by the aristocracy, right? Nobody else could own it because it was given to them by God. It was only God that could stop them through losing wars or whatever. Land couldn't be bought or sold. It was only given to them. It was given to them by right of birth, whatever, right? Obviously, lords could bet with each other, or those sort of things could happen. But what we're talking about is the free market deciding who owns that land. The lord would only sell it to somebody he wants to sell it to. But
well, anyone who I mean, the lord would parcel the land out, obviously, to his serfs to work, which would be the serf class we discussed earlier. But that same lord is never going to sell his land to another person, because that would then make that person the lord. The land was tied pretty much to the economic status, wasn't it? So I guess that's what he's saying though.
Yeah. So what happens there is, it says it in this paragraph. It's about capitalism and the changing the relationship to landowner, right? By making land subject to the market, right? It can be bought and sold. It's a commodity now. It's not just a lord's birthright. Do you get what I'm saying? You in feudal times, if I'm your younger brother, I have no right to that land unless I am the heir to the land, right? I've got to kill you to get that land off you.
Yeah.
It's that idea. Whereas under capitalism, you can just buy it if you've got enough money. It doesn't matter what status you are, whether it's your blood right, birthright, whatever, right? It's subject to the market. But anyway, somebody was saying Prince Charles is a capitalist now because he has to grow veg on his land. Yes, what he's doing there is capitalist, which makes him a capitalist. But at the same time, he is of the aristocratic class. Now, if you can have the concept of, I mean, capitalists always like to do this thing where they go, I was a working class lad, and I just made $1 billion. Do you know what I mean? Jeff Bezos isn't from a landed family. Some of them are from rich backgrounds, but that's just because their dad made money before them. But them in themselves are usually unlanded. They're not from the gentry, right? So Prince Charles is competing with people who aren't from the aristocratic class. So although he is a capitalist, the reason why he's a capitalist is because his status as a member of the nobility is subservient to the capitalist class now, right? That's why you can say the Queen is a capitalist. Yeah, because she exists under capitalism, right? She got to partake in capitalism, but she's still a member of the aristocracy. But she doesn't have any political power because we know we're living under a bourgeois dictatorship. That's what we're talking about here. Anyway, Joe, read on from third.
Before you go on from there, I think it's interesting to note that without the activities of capital, the Queen and Prince Charles and all that would be without any actual capital.
Exactly.
Because that's what you're getting at. Essentially, a point to make is that when a bourgeois revolution happens, except for in France, they don't generally tend to kill the monarchy. They will try to make the monarchy into members of the bourgeoisie so that the monarchy doesn't lose any of its tangible power. The monarch will still have money, wealth and land, but it won't be because, as you say, God gave them that land and they have serfs on it. It will be because the capitalists have made this deal with them in the transfer of power, where they say that, look, this is going to be happening. We will either cut your head off with a guillotine, or you can maintain the majority of your power, but it will be derived from capital rather than from God himself.
There's an easier way to understand that, right? And that is to compare what we've just talked about, which is what happened to the British royal family when the bourgeoisie took over the state of Britain, right? So look at how the relationship to the economy and maintaining their riches, the royal family, that differs between being a feudal lord and being a member of the aristocracy who has to partake in capitalism, right? Look at the difference between that relationship and what the communists in China did to the last emperor, right? They proletarianized him. It's that same principle, isn't it? So royals under bourgeois revolution get bourgeoisified, right? Royals under a proletarian dictatorship, in the perfect scenario, I mean, obviously in Russia certain measures had to be taken because of civil war or whatever context. That context always matters. But in the case of just China, they put the last emperor through re-education and proletarianized him, didn't they? They took away his status, his power, his political power as a member of the aristocracy, and proletarianized him.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I mean, obviously, both France and Russia were inopportune times. The bourgeois revolution in France, because obviously there were reactionary forces, reactionary at the time, reacting against the bourgeois revolution and wanting to reimpose a monarch in a position of absolute monarchy. They had to guillotine him. So fair enough. And the same with the Russians, when obviously there was the White Army was trying to put the Tsar back in power, or a member of the Tsar's family. So the entire family had to be wiped out because they couldn't afford to let that happen, kind of thing. They had to wipe out every vestige. But yeah, as you say, in a perfect situation, perfect being China for the proletarian revolution, and
Britain.
Britain.
They're
being,
both perfect examples of class collusion, or how they collude with that other class, right? Both of them together. That's what we're getting at. All right, Joe, read this last bit. Third,
everywhere the proletariat developed in step with the bourgeoisie. In proportion as the bourgeoisie grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. For since the proletarians can be employed only by capital, and since capital extends only through employing labour, it follows that the growth of the proletariat proceeds at precisely the same pace as the growth of capital. Simultaneously, the process draws members of the bourgeoisie and proletarians together into great cities where industry can be carried on most profitably, and by throwing great masses in one spot, it gives the proletarians a consensus on their own strength.
consciousness.
I can't speak. Sorry.
Right.
Moreover, the further this process advances, more new labor-saving machines are invented. The greater is the pressure exercised by big industry on wages, which, as we have seen, sink to their minimum and therewith render the condition of the proletariat increasingly unbearable. The growing dissatisfaction of the proletariat thus joins with its rising power to prepare a proletarian social revolution.
I think a great example of this in the modern age is the way, a perfect example that we can see today is the way that you've got machines replacing humans on a more
Well, it's literally that.
Yeah, on a more literal sense. Obviously, whereas one man and his loom were replaced by 10 artisans and their 10 looms were replaced by one spinning jenny and one proletarian. That the same now, what we're seeing is proletarians who, for example, have worked in Asda or Tesco or any big supermarket, and they're all becoming unemployed due to the complete mechanization of their workload by the likes of self-service checkouts and things like this. And obviously, as AI develops, we're going to see more and more of this. If AI develops under a bourgeois dictatorship, as we're seeing in the likes of America, these machines are not used to kind of make the proletariat have an easier life. They're used to destroy the proletarian class bit by bit.
Yeah, and that's not a debate. Like, that's not up for debate. Engels noticed it then, and it's been the same way every time. If they didn't, it would be an obscurity to the rule, right? If they didn't, for once, when the capitalist class give something up, it's an obscurity to the rule, like the foundation of the NHS or whatever. It's an obscurity to the rule, but a capitalist will want you to think that that's the base standard, isn't it? Well, look, we gave you the NHS. Please don't turn up at our gates. What more do you want? Like, let them eat cake. It's that same thing, isn't it? Anything else you want to add on to that one?
No, good.
But I mean, I think there's a good point in there where it says this explains the massive. This is why climate change is a response of capitalism. This is Engels literally talking about how capitalism causes nature to change. When he says the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeoisie, right? In proportion. As the bourgeois grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. If that's not a historic... Remember, this is written in 1847, so this is just when people are starting to get electricity in their houses, starting to, like it says later on, move to the cities. Before this is small people living on small plots of land, and as Engels mentions there, you wouldn't have a serf wouldn't have more kids than his work can support without dipping into what he gives to the Lord, right? So he would have enough family. This is why you have whole families that work on these plots. Back to the rope sellers or whatever, it was a whole family that worked there, even their kids, but they would only have enough kids to support themselves from the amount of rope they could produce, right? Because otherwise they're making the portions that everybody gets to eat smaller for themselves, aren't they? The more mouths to feed.
When it says the more wealth the proletariat, the more wealth the bourgeoisie attains, the larger the proletariat becomes. I think what he's also saying there implicitly, which people might not pick up on straight away, is that's monopoly capitalism. What he's saying there, he's saying that as one individual capitalist becomes wealthier than 10 smaller capitalists, those 10 small capitalists are forced by the laws of competition to become proletariat. And this is what you're seeing now with the extreme, centralization of capital in the hands of like 3 or 4 large capitalists in every country. Like you've got, Bezos, Gates, Branson in the UK. All of these large capitalists now have destroyed every kind of small business that has any kind of that poses any kind of threat to them, and as such, all those people that would have previously been petty bourgeois have now become essentially proletarians in name. And this is an important point to pick up on, and that's why obviously when you've got like the things like issues like climate change, it's always the responsibility of this kind of 4% ruling class or whatever, however large it is. I think it's actually 1% now. 1% of the population is this. So this is what we're seeing.
But 1% of the population was it then? It was just that there was less
of a population.
Yeah, the population boom happens, doesn't it? The number of billionaires goes up every year, doesn't it? Because the planet is generating more wealth, because wealth is just abstract, isn't it? So it can continue to go up. Jeff Bezos makes like $250,000 a minute, so it's something ludicrous that you can't even... I remember in the 90s hearing Bill Gates earns $50,000 every 15 seconds. I'm guessing that's not stopped for 40 years. Do you know what I mean? It's a lot more now. But it doesn't actually mean anything, does it? Nobody's printing off $1 for Bill Gates every time he needs his dollars. His account goes up by 1, right?
Yeah, I think this is why you saw the capitalists purposefully get rid of things like the gold standard and stuff like this, because that kind of limited the amount of wealth that they could accrue. Whereas now, obviously, you've got this kind of system whereby, as you say, wealth is an abstract concept. It's not even just printed bits of paper anymore. It's numbers on a screen. It's evolved from having to print physical hard cash into literally just being a number on a screen that you can increase or decrease at will. And as such, wealth is literally limitless now, whereas there used to be artificial limits placed on it, like when you tied it to, for example, the price of gold. I mean, obviously, I know it's still tied to the price of oil today, but that's because oil is still being extracted at like the rates that it is. Although we constantly talk about how oil will run out, it's at the state, as soon as oil does run out, the oil standard will no longer be the thing that capitalists tie their money to. It'll be green energy or something else, something other abstract concept, because it's all about maintaining this ability to make wealth endless.
Exactly, and turn that wealth into physical items, like you saw after the crash of 2008. All that subjective wealth turned into hard assets. Ferrari sales went up, mansion sales went up amongst rich people, right? As they transfer that fake wealth into something physical for the capitalist to benefit off. This, created from the stolen wages of workers, Jeff Bezos going to space, whatever, right? But anyway, Engels there, when he's talking about the population boom that comes along with capitalism, is to explain for mass poverty since Victorian times, isn't it, in countries, and especially in ones that have been imperialized as well, where because of the quote unquote boom of industry that comes with proletarianizing it, at the rate that capitalism has done in terms of human history. I mean, look, we were feudal for 2,000 plus years, however many years, how do you want to go back? But we've only been capitalist for, 400 years at best, since the 1600s, and it's already wrecked the planet. The capitalism has done more damage to the planet in those years than the last 10,000 years of human history before it, right?
Yeah.
And it's that population boom, and it's that poverty that's come from it, and it's that illogical chase for profit so Jeff Bezos can go to space and catch Skittles in his mouth. Right, let's carry on, Tom. This one's you, isn't it? Number 12.
What were the further consequences of the Industrial Revolution? Big industry created in the steam engine and other machines the means of endlessly expanding industrial production, speeding it up and cutting its costs. With production thus facilitated, the free competition, which is necessarily bound up with big industry, assumed the most extreme forms. A multitude of capitalists invaded industry and, in a short while, was more produced than was needed. As a consequence, finished commodities could not be sold, and a so-called commercial crisis broke out. Factories thus had to be closed, their owners went bankrupt, and the workers were without bread. Deepest misery reigned everywhere. After a time, the superfluous products were sold, the factories began to operate again, wages rose, and gradually business got better than ever. But it was not long before too many commodities were again produced and a new crisis broke out, only to follow the same course as its predecessor. Ever since the beginning of this 19th century, the condition of industry has constantly fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis. Nearly every 5 to 7 years, a fresh crisis has intervened, always with the greatest hardship for workers and always accompanied by general revolutionary stirrings and the direct peril to which the whole existing order of things.
Right. Now, when you're listening back to that, I was trying to visualize it in the real world, but it didn't click there until right at the end, when you were talking about it's fluctuated between periods of prosperity and periods of crisis. Nearly every 5 to 7 years, a fresh crisis has intervened, and always with the greatest hardship for workers, always accompanied by general revolutionary stirrings and direct peril to the whole existing order of things. Look, when Lenin read that line, Lenin must have been thinking of that the whole time Russia was in World War One, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the material reality of. This is why Engels and Marx is just spot on, isn't it? It just predicts the entire course of working class history in like 2 lines. It's insane.
But the thing is, this has not stopped, has it? I mean, we still see, maybe not every 5 to 7 years now, because capitalists have
drawn out time, haven't they? Yeah,
they've sort of learned from their mistakes, in not so much in that they want to change their means of their mode of production, but they know that 5 to 7 years is not tenable because it will just produce revolution. So now you see one maybe every 10 to 20 years, which is obviously the last major crisis we all saw economically was austerity, and in the West, austerity and the financial crisis of 2008. But prior to that, it was 2000, so it was about 10 years. It's roughly 10-year periods. And I think what's really interesting, what I was noticing about this, was there's only ever been 2 countries in history. 2 large countries in history. I'm sure this also applies to the other socialist states, but that are completely unaffected by these global capitalist crises. They are China and the USSR. During the kind of various boom bust cycles throughout history, the USSR never really experienced them in the same way that the West did. And China, because obviously it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, even though it uses a capitalist mode of production, the fact that it's led by communists in a communist party who understand dialectical materialism, they prepare for these crises, so they have abundance of production to make up for these shortfalls. And as such, the only country that kind of kept going during the 2008 crash was China, because it was one of the largest socialist countries in the world, and it had the resilience to kind of push back against these market forces, which is why you saw China actually buying up the debt of most of these countries, which is now why you hear things like China owns all our debt. About Americans saying this. It's true. It's because during the 2008 crisis, China bailed everyone out, and it was another kind of aspect of China playing like 5D chess with the Western nations and like preparing them for when the inevitable crash does come that ends them all. China is there to kind of hold the wealth back.
And also, even the first bit when he's talking about capitalism will overproduce, right? I mean, I remember one of the arguments that the left gave for leaving the EU in Britain was that like workers were being forced to like overproduce food, and it would go to like waste in a warehouse somewhere in Europe because of the way that the capitalist planned economy of Europe was set up. That it meant that food would just go to waste whilst people starved. I mean, if that's not enough to try and change the system, I don't know what else is. Big industry says no, though, right? We've already planned this. It's not going to happen, right? Is this me, number 13?
Yeah, I'd say this bit here.
Go on.
I know. I feel like we're currently in the process of the kind of the bust cycle, because this is the boom and bust cycle, which
yeah.
Well, I think part of it because of the epidemic. But then this is like the purpose of, I know, also trying to prioritize its citizens, and other socialists it took a scientific approach, not a profit approach. But there's a reason why China's the only growing economy properly, out of the major countries, because which is another example. Well, in these times of crisis, normally the capitalists will push the loss of profit onto the worker. So that's why that worker will get fired instead of that a lot of the times they'll try and cut costs whatever to make sure that this is
close all the mines down in a country, for example.
So that's why you're seeing the huge in America you see the huge lines for food lines and whatever. You see they still haven't got their with Biden they were supposed to get the extra $600. They still haven't got that yet. They're still. That was an
election pledge as well.
Exactly. So you're seeing that kind of the capitalists push the burden they've had onto the proletariat, even though it was the system in place, which is they're the one that uphold it, which literally crashes every 5 to 7 years. Well, it crashes very regularly. So it's a bit of a which kind of exposes itself.
I think as well, just adding on to what you say there, that kind of plays into a country's class consciousness will always be how willing the country is to give, how willing the bourgeoisie is to give concessions to the proletariat. Obviously in Britain, we were all given a fairly decent, fair low wage. All wage workers were given 80% of their wage, up to 100% for some companies during the pandemic. The government had to mandate free testing, free vaccination programs, all these kind of things. Whereas in America, because they know the class consciousness is so low and the communism is such a dirty word to Americans, they literally don't need to do these things. They can just say, oh, well, a $600 check would be communism.
Yeah, well, it's not even that, Tom. You can historically compare this as well, right? Because look at the Victorian capitalist in the UK, who some of them voted against World War One in Parliament because it would have they didn't want to kill their own workers because it didn't serve their economic interest to enter the war. These are the capitalists who would build a school to educate their workers because then they can...
The national bourgeoisie.
Well, not the national bourgeoisie, but they are the bourgeoisie who, like we were talking about earlier, look after people in a way because that means more profit to them, right? And then there are the capitalists who just chase profit brazenly, right? And will still use slavery to this day and stuff. So a lot of these battles and ebbs and flows that we're talking about in that point are battles between those two classes. That's what I'm getting at.
I was just saying, when I say national bourgeoisie, I mean in that context they were the bourgeoisie that rightly wanted to protect their workers, not for any other reason than they needed to keep the wages low and obviously having a large supply of labour, whereas they were fighting against the imperial bourgeoisie, who were very interested in having World War One because it was an imperialist war, to determine who got more parts of Africa and other things like this.
And not just that, but they've also owned the military companies, etc., right?
And the imperial bourgeoisie do not care about losing the domestic workforce, because that's not where their money comes from. Their money comes from exploiting other countries' various populations. So it doesn't matter to them. So again, it's purely class interest, isn't it? That's why I say national bourgeoisie. I mean the ones who are more interested in developing their wealth based on British
the concept of the
proletarians,
state,
as opposed to those who are directly involved in imperialism, like the kind of successors to the East India Company and stuff like this.
And that usually does come down to that definition usually comes down to amount of capital, right? Someone like Jeff Bezos, who's now a billionaire, he's doing business with the entire world, right? So he doesn't give a shit about the concepts of the state or nationalism, right? He's a globalist in that aspect because he will make money all around the globe. He is in this is capitalist illogic capitalism for you, though, isn't it? Because he is still abusing an American capitalist whose business he takes out, Amazon absorbs, and all the workers get laid off when that business eventually moves to wherever Jeff Bezos' slaves factory are, right? It's a story repeated, isn't it, in the West, which has been to like dissolve the national bourgeois in these countries and turn it into this neoliberal one where a company will move to Indonesia, right? And the factory gets shut here after the big capitalist has bought it out. Do you know what I mean? This happened to Cadbury's, hasn't it, in Britain? Cadbury's has been bought out by an American company, and now the product is getting smaller in packets. I'm guessing the workers that worked at that other factory, their jobs have probably been cut. I'd have to look into it. But the product is definitely having its capitalist squeeze applied to it, right? It's that, right? Go on.
It was the company as well. Just to use Cadbury's again for example, the company that owns Toblerone was bought out by American capitalists, and immediately you saw the traditional Toblerone style, which everyone can probably picture as I'm saying it, the little triangles. It made more sense to flatten those triangles off from they were literally saving probably less than a percentage point on margin, right? But it was still enough of a reason to kind of piss off the entire consumer base. Because I remember when it happened, everyone was saying, "Oh, what the fuck? We're not going to buy Toblerones anymore. Look at what they've done to them. They've made them into these like little cubes rather than the triangles we know and all this." But after time, no one cares because that's what the Toblerone is now. And that's
nobody can make another one to compete with
Exactly.
that company because of this monopoly. This is what we're talking about. The national bourgeois or whoever of that. You know, when we're talking about national bourgeois, we're not talking about people who like England. We're talking about people who like the concept of the state, right? Versus the internationalist who likes the concept of cross-border imperialism, right? That's the difference.
Yeah, well, I always refer to them as national bourgeoisie and imperial bourgeoisie, because I think that was the terms that Mao used, and that was what I was saying. Like, obviously, the imperial capitalists in China pre-revolution were perfectly happy to sell out the country, sell concessions to the foreigners, as long as they were making some money from it, and also they could then exploit smaller countries around China. Whereas the national bourgeoisie were being completely oppressed by both the foreign imperial bourgeoisie and their own imperial bourgeoisie. So the primary contradiction in China pre-revolution was the imperial bourgeoisie. It was nothing to do with capitalism as a whole, because capitalism hadn't even grown to full maturation yet. So this is why it was such an interesting concept to see the Chinese Revolution happen, because it kind of went against what we know as a developed obviously Marx and Engels both predicted. Marx predicted that Germany and Britain would be the first two countries to fall to socialist revolution because of the fact that they had the most developed proletariat. And Engels, earlier on, we read him, he said France and England are the two. So it's all these like industrialized Western countries that should have fallen to.
They're the most famous bourgeois revolutions as well. Like
Yes.
Can you tell me about the Greek bourgeois revolution? I mean, there probably
Absolutely
are people who can, but it's not like a trope, is it? The French Revolution is. Everybody knows what the French Revolution is. So that's why this, it's almost correct in terms of developed proletariat, right? Because at that time they had. Anyway,
no, I mean it's the correct assumption to make, because obviously we read earlier he said the Chinese are coming close to a revolution, and he was right. This was written in what, 1870? This
yeah,
book?
but I believe he's talking about.
Revolution.
Yeah, I'm thinking he's talking about the bourgeois revolution, the republic first.
But that was correct, wasn't it? It was close. It was 1911 was the bourgeois revolution, and then the proletarian revolution followed in 1949. So it was, no one really kind of expected the proletarian revolution, is what I'm getting at, because the productive forces within China were not constructed to a point that it made sense for a proletarian revolution to happen, which is why Mao had to use the agricultural proletariat and the serfs as his army, as his Red Army, because there wasn't a proletariat to use. And every time they tried to organize the proletariat in Shanghai or whatever, the foreign imperial capitalists would just massacre them en masse. Because as an imperial capitalist will do, I mean, you're very rarely going to see British capitalists massacring British proletarians en masse, unless it becomes a serious, dire revolutionary situation.
Like in Wales.
Yes, like in Wales when they did. Whereas in China, they were massacring proletarians on a semi-daily basis, because it was just like, oh, well, there's hundreds of millions of Chinese, so we'll just kill these ones and get some new ones, and it's fine. And that's the difference between like imperial bourgeoisie and national bourgeoisie as well. I think the national bourgeoisie are always a lot more frightened of their own proletariat, whereas
they've got more to lose, right? In the shortest period of time. They might have the same views of the people though, but they literally have less capital. That's the point. Right, let's carry on.
Yeah.
Number 13. What follows from these periodic commercial crises? First, that though big industry in its earliest stage created free competition, it has now outgrown free competition. That for big industry, competition and generally the individualistic organisation of production have become a fetter which it must and will shatter. That so long as big industry remains on its present footing, it can be maintained only at the cost of general chaos every 7 years, each time threatening the whole of civilization and not only plunging the proletarians into misery, but also ruining large sections of the bourgeoisie. That's what you're talking about, Tom. The section of the bourgeoisie that also gets ruined in this battle. Hence, either that big industry must itself be given up, which is an absolute impossibility, or that it makes an unavoidable, necessarily an entirely new organisation of society in which production is no longer directed by mutually competing individual industrialists, but rather by the whole society operating according to a definite plan and taking account the needs of all, right?
Just to stop you there, I just want to point out from that very first line that though big industry is in its earliest stage and created free competition, it has now outgrown free competition. And this was in the 1800s, the 1870s, right? And you still see kind of bootlickers to this day saying things like, oh, well, that's not real capitalism, that's corporatism or something like that, because what they're referring to is the monopoly stage of capitalism, and they are kind of idealizing this situation that they've never lived through, a situation that they've never seen before, and they're like, oh, well, pure capitalism is the best because, free enterprise, free trade, all this nonsense. But these people who bootlick this and try and kind of criticize monopoly capitalism, calling it corporatism or whatever word they want to use for it, is irrelevant, because they have never lived in a situation where they actually saw free competition.
But it's not only that, right? They're probably the large section of the bourgeoisie that gets ruined when the inevitable crisis comes around, right? That's the point. Right, okay. Joe, do you want to add anything to any of this? Because I'll carry on if not.
I mean, it's fairly obvious. What has been said has been...
All right. Second, that big industry and the limitless expansion of production, which it makes possible, bring within the range of feasibility a social order in which so much is produced that every member of society will be in a position to exercise and develop all his powers and faculties in complete freedom. It thus appears that the very big qualities of big industry which, in our present-day society, produce misery and the crises are those which, in different form of society, will abolish this misery and these catastrophic depressions. We see with the greatest clarity, 1. that all these evils are from now on to be ascribed solely to a social order which no longer corresponds to the requirements of the real situation, and 2. that it is possible through a new social order to do away with these evils altogether, right? Socialist revolution, aka, right? The socialism or barbarism, that's what we're talking about there. Who's next?
I am.
Joe.
Go on then. Number 14. What will this new social order have to be like?
Above all, it will have to take control of industry and branches of production out of the hands of the mutually competing individuals, and instead institute a system in which all branches of production are operated by society as a whole. That is, for the common account, according to a common plan, and for the participation of all members of society.
Just stop you there, Joe. Just one sentence to add to that. This is the difference between individualism and communalism, isn't it? And this is why communal societies always tend to have more of an understanding of this. Do continue.
It will, in other words, abolish competition and replace it with association. Moreover, since the management of industry by individuals necessarily implies private property, and since competition is in reality merely the manner and form in which control of industry by private property owners express itself, it follows that private property cannot be separated from competition and the individual management of industry. Private property must, therefore, be abolished, and in its place must come the common utilization of all instruments of production and the distribution of all products according to the common agreement. In a word, what is the common ownership of goods? In fact, the abolition of private property is doubtless the shortest and most significant way to characterize a revolution in the whole series social order which had been made necessary by developing industry. And for this reason, it is rightly advanced by communists as their main demand.
Right, okay. That last sentence, the abolition of private property, is, the capitalists did this in the first place when, further on, when Engels is talking about how the capitalists managed to destroy the power of the aristocracy in one swoop by making all their land up for sale, right? Because now the royal who doesn't have as much money as the guild master merchant, whatever, he's now going to lose out to him because it's the free market is going to decide, etc. So if the creation of private property managed to destroy feudalism in such a short and most significant way, then so the abolition of private property is the shortest and most significant way to undo that, right? But instead of giving it to the Lord by God, land will be given to all citizens who reside on it, right? And this is just land collectivization, isn't it? The collectivization of the means of production,
and also the nationalization of large industrial businesses. That in itself is the same thing, if done under a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah. Well, this is Bolshevik socialism in one country ideas, isn't it? But we're just talking about the Marxist theory behind that led to those ideas that came later from Lenin and stuff. When he's going, well, the German Revolution's not going as quick as we expected, that Marx and Engels expected as well, right? So we have to come up with a new plan, and that's socialism in one country, isn't it? Which is the abolition of private property under the concept of the state. It's just a different way of making that line come true, isn't it? Anything else to add, or should we move on?
Move on.
Go on then. It's just you, right?
Was not the abolition of private property possible at an earlier time? No. Every change in the social order, every revolution in property relations is the necessary consequence of the creation of new forces of production which no longer fit into the old property relations. Private property has not always existed. When towards the end of the Middle Ages there arose a new mode of production which could not be carried on under the then existing feudal and guild forms of property, This manufacture, which had helped grow the old property relations, created a new property form, private property. And for manufacture and the earlier stage of development of big industry, private property was the only possible property form. The social order based on it was the only possible social order. So long as it is not possible to produce so much that there is enough for all, with more left over for expanding the social capital and extending the forces of production, so long as this is not possible, there must always be a ruling class directing the use of society's productive forces, and a poor, oppressed class. How these classes are constituted depends on the stage of development.
Right, okay, let me stop you there. The word poor doesn't just mean financially poor, does it? That could be politically poor.
Yeah.
Which I think leads you into what you were talking about earlier. Socialism in one country. Carry on.
The agrarian Middle Ages gave us the baron and the serf. The cities of the later Middle Ages show us the guildmaster and the journeyman and the day labourer. And the 17th century has its manufacturing workers. The 19th has big factory owners and proletarians. It is clear that, up to now, the forces of production have never been developed to the point where enough could be developed for all, and that private property has become a fetter and a barrier in relation to the further development of the forces of production.
Mm-hmm.
Now, however, the development of big industry has ushered in a new period. Capital and the forces of production have been expanded to an unprecedented extent, and the means are at hand to multiply them without limit in the near future. Moreover, the forces of production have been concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeois, whilst the great mass of the people are more and more falling into the proletariat, their situation becoming wretched and intolerable in proportion to the increase of wealth of the bourgeoisie. And finally, these mighty and easily extended forces of production have so far outgrown private property and the bourgeoisie that they threaten at any moment to unleash the most violent disturbances of the social order. Now, under these conditions, the abolition of private property has not only become possible, but absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting.
If you want a physical example of that, you just look at the socialist response to World War II, the USSR turning into a production line, right?
I think when people talk about like the abolition of class, under communism, a classless, moneyless society, when they hear the word class, they don't realize that what this means is that every single person will be a proletarian, because obviously the abolition of the private property means that there is no more bourgeois. It doesn't mean, I think some younger leftists who have got like a kind of violence complex going on think that means the second a revolution comes round, every member of the bourgeoisie is strung to a wall and executed. This is an opinion that people hold, and it's wrong. The abolition of classes comes about as a result of the proletarianization of these bourgeoisie, as a result of the abolition of private property, which can only be done under, the guidance of a victorious proletariat organized as the state. I don't know if that was very wordy, what I just said there. Probably was. But
no, it makes sense, doesn't it? Because it matches Marx when Marx says, "Look, it's only possible to achieve real liberation in the real world by employing real means. That slavery cannot be abolished without the steam engine, and the mill and the spinning jenny. Serfdom cannot be abolished without improved agriculture, and that in general, people cannot be liberated as long as they are unable to obtain food and drink, housing and clothing in adequate quality and quantity. Liberation is a historical and not a mental act. It is brought about by historical conditions, the development of industry, commerce, agriculture, and the conditions of intercourse, not that kind of intercourse." I know Theo's listening. I know he's like. But yeah, in saying that, right, that's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. And also, I think it's interesting to note that, when as Engels says here, the agrarian Middle Ages gave us the baron and the serf, the cities of the later Middle Ages, the guildmaster and the journeyman, and the day labourer, And the 17th century has its manufacturing workers, the 19th has its big factory owners and proletarians. And since the 19th century, we're now in the 21st century, so 200 years later, we have not seen a kind of significant shift in class relations.
Well, we have now. It's instead of big factories, they've got big offices, haven't they, in the core?
No, of course, yeah. But what I mean is the classification of bourgeois and proletarian is still relevant today because you still have the owners and you still have the workers, the wage laborers. There hasn't been a change in the societal mode of production since the 19th century, and that's why I think you occasionally hear people mostly online, but some kind of like Fox News commentators and stuff saying like what was my point? Oh my god,
Fox News.
Yeah.
You'll get some Fox News reporters say,
yeah, oh shit. No, it's okay. Just move on. It'll come.
Well, you're reading this one anyway.
I'm done on. I think this one's done.
Oh, wait. All right. Okay. So it's back around to me, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just scroll down on this. It's at the top. I think we've got like a little bit of time left, about 15 minutes. We might get to near the end of this. Where are we at? Will the peaceful abolition of private property be possible? It would be desirable if this could happen, and the communists would certainly be the last to oppose it. Communists only know too well that all conspiracies are not only useless but even harmful. They know all too well that revolutions are not made intentionally or arbitrary, but that everywhere and always there have been the necessary consequence of conditions which were wholly independent of the will and direction of individual parties and entire classes. But they also see that the development of the proletariat in nearly all civilized countries has been violently suppressed, and that in this way the opponents of communism have been working towards revolution with all their strength. If the oppressed proletariat is finally driven to revolution, then we communists will defend the interests of the proletarians with the deeds as we now defend them with words. Right?
Yeah. So
and hold on. Before we go and discuss this, I just want to say, when we're talking about violent revolution, we're not actually talking. It doesn't mean physical violence, human fighting, does it? Because it just means that like society is going to have. It's the definition of the word, not the act, right? There's going to be a violent change in society on a whole level. And that's because capitalists will do all they can to stop it from happening. Now, if the entire proletariat could come to a consensus that they were just going to have socialism now, and the capitalists went, all right, yeah, cool, then it would be peaceful. We know that that's not possible, right? That's the difference. The US has nukes to stop this happening. We know it's not possible. The East India Company would just mow down British Indian villages, right, that resisted working. So it's always been the case that capitalists will violently suppress any sort of organisational of the proletariat. Go on.
I was just going to say, this is obviously kind of, it's Engels predicting the future, isn't it? Because at this point there hadn't been a socialist revolution. All following socialist revolutions had an aspect of violence to them, be that in the civil war that followed in Russia after the Bolsheviks won, because actually the Bolshevik revolution itself was relatively bloodless. It was the civil war that followed it that was the kind of, it was the reaction of the bourgeoisie and the elements of feudalism that kind of opposed it. In China, we saw the actual revolution was relatively violent. A lot of landowners had to be put to death because they refused to collectivize their land when they were told to, and that's just how it works. Now, what I was getting at before when I said that we would proletarianize the bourgeoisie, and you don't have to kill every member of the bourgeoisie.
But look, right, hold on. Before you go on, the bourgeoisie did exactly the same, didn't they? This is the royals being beheaded in France. How can... I mean, this is the comparison, right? Capitalists will romanticize the French Revolution, and it's almost like, yes, the guillotine is seen as this cultural icon of liberty and stuff like this, and you can romanticize about the French Revolution, but the Bolsheviks are really bad for doing it. The exact same.
Yeah.
And it just shows you whose class interest is at play, doesn't it, when you compare those two events? Go on.
I was going to say, when I said earlier that you don't need to kill every capitalist in order to proletarianize the state and to make the abolition of classes come about, but the initial acts of revolution whereby the proletariat is placed in charge as the dominant ruling class are always bound to be violent, because there will always be the reaction whereby the capitalists refuse to allow that to happen. That will be where the majority of violence happens, and the rest of it, like in China today, you don't see, for example, when Xi Jinping comes in and says, right, that business is now it's now part of the state, you don't see the Chinese members of the Chinese bourgeoisie violently opposing Xi Jinping, do you? Because Xi Jinping represents the working class.
No, but hold on. No, but in the act of the state being able to do that is in itself violent, right? Quote unquote violent. It's not violent in that like they turn up and smash everything up or beat people, but the ability to wield that supreme power of over that class is violent, right? Now, what Engels is talking about here is it would be perfect if capitalists didn't oppress or go against the views of the proletariat in the first place, so we wouldn't have to do things like that, and they would just toe the line. Pardon me. They would just toe the line by being a member of an oppressed class anyway, in the same way that the monarchs have done under capitalism, right? You don't see monarchs in the West try to re-establish monarchy. Prince Charles isn't trying to get his crown back and start having, rebuilding castles across the land, is he? He's not trying to get those economic conditions. He's happy to live as a collaborator, right?
Yeah.
That's the difference. He acts peacefully as a comprador to the capitalist class.
What I'm getting at though is I understand that obviously when he says violent in this context, it's about wielding authority and not so much about physical acts of violence.
Yes, that's one aspect of it, but it's more violence as a concept, the power structure of violence, right?
Yeah. What I'm getting at though is the revolution itself will always be, to some extent, actually bloodily violent. Like there's never been a peaceful revolution in history.
But that's because it's the capitalist class who decide that, right?
I know. It's always a reaction to their.
So this is what Engels is talking about. It would be desirable if this could happen, but
when you've got dictatorships of the proletariat or the working class organized as the state, what I'm getting at is they don't need to go and drag Jack Ma out of his office and threaten him at gunpoint to take his companies anymore, because Jack Ma, even though he's a capitalist in China, he acknowledges that the dominant power structure in China today is the proletariat. They are the state. So
that's true.
So when they say to him, look, your business is getting nationalized, whereas that wouldn't happen in a place like Britain, which is under a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, the dictatorship of the proletariat has the power to, in a more peaceful manner than would be necessary in a revolutionary situation, they can just take the property of the bourgeoisie, which is great. That's why I'm saying, like, post-revolution, less bloodshed will be spilt, physical bloodshed.
No, violence will become more conceptual, and I mean it's still violent, quote unquote violent.
I agree with
that. The court can have that power to come to Jack Ma's office and arrest him instead of being at gunpoint. That is a violent act of one class holding power over another. It is. Whether it's physically violent is just the fact that the power structure is reversed at that moment in history. Right, number 17. Joe, is this you? We're gonna do 17 and 18, and then we're gonna finish up for this week. So go on.
Would it be possible for private property to be abolished at one stroke? No. No more than existing forces of production can at one stroke be multiplied to the extent necessary for the creation of a communal society. In all probability, The proletarian revolution will transform existing society gradually and will be able to abolish private property only when the means of production are available in sufficiency.
Right, okay.
That sounds like Engels is a Dengist to me.
Does sound like him. Exactly.
Dengels.
I mean, that's the idea of the you've got to teach people to read before they can, understand these concepts. But once you've taught them to read, that's enough. The gears of history are set in motion then, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Right, let's carry on, because it's a short one, that, and this last one's a long one. What will be the course of this revolution? We can see how on point Engels were before we end, if it all was what tweaks Lenin made. Right, above all, it will establish a democratic constitution, and through this, the direct or indirect dominance of the proletariat. Direct in England, where the proletarians are already a majority of the people. Indirect in France and Germany, where the majority of the people consist not only of proletarians, but also of small peasants and petty bourgeois, who are in the process of falling into the proletariat, who are more and more dependent in all their political interests on the proletariat, and who must therefore soon adapt to the demands of the proletariat. Perhaps this will cost a second struggle, but the outcome can only be the victory of the proletariat. Now, before I read on, I want to give you a quick example of when capitalists will show that they're on the process of falling into the proletariat, who are dependent on the proletariat, right? And the difference is, did the imperialist class who started the Opium Wars, the East India Company, get the permission of, or did they ask the consensus of the everyday British proletariat at the time that literally couldn't read? Did they ask their permission on what they thought on it? No. But these days they have to get public support, don't they, for the war in Iraq and stuff like that. They have to argue, they have to make these arguments to the proletariat now to justify the imperialist actions they get. And that's why, Joe, I think you're right earlier when you said we are in a stage of capitalist crisis now, because they are having to do things like that. Were you going to come in there, Joe?
I was saying, so even for say the Iraq War, they didn't have to, maybe they give the illusion of they have to say pretend to try and get public support. But I mean, in the UK, I would say that support for the Iraq War was zero. There wasn't really support for it, but they still did it anyway. They don't they can, there's a whole not illusion, but kind of there's a whole kind of more the theatre of it.
Yeah. But that's what it's talking about there. And I mean, there are direct examples of that fit this, like the creation of the NHS. They've got to rely on the proletariat, haven't they?
I suppose what you're getting at though, Fran, is that obviously back in the day when you saw gunboats sailing for China to go and take Hong Kong away from them, there was never there was a vote in Parliament, should we go to war with China? There was, and that did happen, and it was obviously came back, yes, we should. And that was over the burning of opium, the Chinese destruction of opium crops. There was a vote on whether to go to war over that, but there was no necessity to sell that decision to the greater mass of the proletariat.
And I'm guessing before then as well that the everyday proletariat didn't have the vote in Britain yet. It wasn't until the Chartist movements demanded it, was it? The capitalists have to listen to the proletariat, because otherwise, their political interests get taken over by the proletariat, as we've seen in Russia, China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., etc.
And
when they don't listen,
they're building the consent for this war as well. Obviously, it goes hand in hand with all of the NGOs and shit we've got now, where they'll try and create a fear of these people to try and scare the proletariat into being in favor. Where you've got Saddam's got weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly.
It was the only way you can do it, because then you've still got some war hawks and some liberals amongst the proletariat who will be we need to go and destroy them weapons of mass destruction, and you only need the consent of a tiny majority of the group to then parade that as that actually being the majority of the group.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Right, let's carry on.
But as Joe says, it is theatre. It's all theatre.
Yeah, of course. But they're doing it for their own economic interest, aren't they? But they're still dependent on the proletariat for their continued existence of being able to go and rape Iraq, right? Democracy would be wholly valueless to the proletariat if it was not immediately used as a means for putting through measures directed against private property and ensuring the livelihood of the proletariat. The main measures emerging as the necessary result of existing relations are the following: limitation of private property through progressive taxation, heavy inheritance taxes, abolition of inheritance through collateral lines, brothers, nephews, etc., forced loans, etc. Gradual expropriation of landowners, industrialists, railroad magnates, ship owners, partly through competition by state industry, partly directly through compensation in the form of bonds. 3. Confiscation of the possessions of all emigrants and rebels against the majority of the people. Organisation of labour or employment of proletarians on publicly owned land in factories and workshops, with competition among the workers being abolished, and with factory owners, in so far as they still exist, being obliged to pay the same high wages as those paid by the state. 5. An equal obligation on all members of society to work until such time as private property has been completely abolished. Formation of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 6. Centralisation of money and credit in the hands of the state through the national bank with state capital, and the suppression of all private banks and bankers. 7. Increase in the number of national factories, workshops, railroads, ships, bringing new lands into cultivation, and the improvement of land already under cultivation, all in proportion to the growth of the capital and labour force at the disposal of the nation. 8. Education of all children from the moment they can leave their mother's care in national establishments at national cost, education and production together. 9. Construction on public lands of great palaces as communal dwellings for associated groups of citizens engaged in both industry and agriculture, and combining their way of life, the advantages of urban and rural conditions, while avoiding the one-sidedness and drawbacks of each. 10. The destruction of all unhealthy and jerry-built dwellings in urban districts, aka slum clearing. 11. Equal inheritance rights for children born in and out of wedlock. I mean, that one sounds like it's of the times, but let's carry on. It probably still applies to a lot of places. 12. Concentration of all means of transportation in the hands of the nation. It is impossible, of course, to carry out all these measures at once, but one will bring in others in its wake. Once the first radical attack on private property has been launched, the proletariat will find itself forced to go even further, to concentrate increasingly in the hands of the state. All capital, all agriculture, all transport, all trade, all the foregoing measures are directed to this end, and they will become practicable and feasible, capable of producing their centralising effects to precisely the degree that the proletariat, through its labour, multiplies the country's productive forces. Finally, when all capital, all production, all exchange have been brought together in the hands of the nation, private property will disappear of its own accord, money will become superficious, and production will soon expand, and man can change that society will be able to slow off whatever of its old economic habits may retain.
I think just going back to the initial start of the points, where he says democracy will be wholly valueless to the proletariat if it is not immediately used as a means of putting through measures directed against private property, and then lists the measures, right? Now, I think what is being got at here by both Marx and Engels is that in Britain they believed that socialism could have been attained through a democratic bourgeois means by the election of the Labour Party. Now, we obviously have seen, since the Labour Party has been elected multiple times and just acted as a normal capitalist party, didn't actually act in the interests of the workers, that the vast majority of these things were never done. So this is kind of like, as you said earlier, this was prior to universal suffrage. This was prior to the proletariat being given the vote. So it's a reasonable assumption to make that if the proletariat did establish a a workers' party within the confines of bourgeois democracy, they would be able to push for these things. And
but
then
this is, hold on, I want to just correct you a little bit there, because he's not talking about the UK parliamentary means, because the Labour Party doesn't get founded for like another 50 years, does it?
No, that's what I'm getting at though.
The Labour Party comes through these instructions and the ebbs and flows of, you know, socialist revolution building that is going on throughout history. This has been written, the context of this being written is when Engels wrote this, right, and then showed it to Marx, and Marx was like, we should write this into a political manifesto. And it's probably based on this section that they decided, this should be a party manifesto, right?
Mm-hmm. What I'm getting at is I'm not saying that this.
So hold on. No, I'm not saying it's proven wrong. But what I want you to get is these aren't instructions for a Labour Party under bourgeois democracy. These are demands for a communist party.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. What I'm getting at though is that even when you have a party that calls itself the left wing and attempts to root itself in the working class, like the Labour Party prior to kind of like the 1920s, post universal suffrage in Britain, one of the issues is, I think the first sentence was proved correct. Democracy has been proved to be wholly valueless to the proletariat. I mean, the Labour Party did push for some of these things, such as the kind of what's the word? The nationalisation of rail infrastructure and other means of transport, which is point number 12. Point number 12.
Education.
And right. The education policies.
But you're right.
Hang on. Let me just finish. So basically, what I'm saying is, although they did some of these things, they were giving more concessions to the bourgeoisie, which has proved that the bourgeois system of democracy, as Engels predicts, has been wholly valueless to the proletariat. Like, he's saying it would be wholly valueless to the proletariat if this didn't happen. We tried to make it happen through the election of the Labour Party on multiple occasions when the Labour Party was what it actually stood for and wasn't simply another arm of the imperialist bourgeois state.
I don't agree with that point though, right? I think you're correct up until you say that the Labour Party has tried to use these things. I think you're wrong in your assessment of the Labour Party. I think the Labour Party shows that the bourgeois, like Engels has talked about before, that the bourgeoisie is prepared to appear as if it's on the side of the worker at certain points. You know, we're going very back to that part where Engels was talking about sometimes the capitalist will give more to the workers, but remember, that's always done because it's in the interest of the capitalist. And I think the Labour Party is that. I mean, it's dressed up in red to make it appear like it's the party of the worker, but in practice it's not, is it? It takes part in the bourgeoisie system literally. Lots of imperial wars have been started on the consent of the Labour Party, which if it was a workers' party wouldn't. It's the fact that it's always been a example of when the proletariat are dependent in their political interests on the proletariat, they have to create things like social democratic parties, which came from, I mean, you've got to think the Labour Party came from liberals who agreed with Engels but were of the other class, right? So they knew that they had to give concessions to the workers because otherwise they turn up at your manor gates or refuse to come into the factory or hang the boss or whatever, because that's what used to happen. So I think those concessions that you're talking about, it's just a bit of a different assessment of the Labour Party. Would you agree? You're right in what you were saying before. I just think that if you're going to mention the Labour Party, they're not an example of that. It's the fact that the Labour Party exists which has stopped a true communist party developing in the UK, isn't it? You had the Communist Party of Great Britain and it did have times of strength, but it's always been beaten back by the bourgeois section of the Labour movement, which is the Labour Party.
Yeah, no,
so
I agree.
The CPB will want these parts, and the Labour Party will also pick and choose some of these parts, limitations on private property through tax or whatever soft measure they come up with. but they will never go all the way. That's the point, isn't it?
No, I completely agree, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think I'm saying that there was a general kind of consensus, even amongst Lenin, when he initially thought that the Labour Party itself could be co-opted as a vehicle for change, which has, what I'm saying is that was proven incorrect by the subsequent kind of elections of the Labour Party, which, as you say, gave consent to various bourgeois imperial wars, but also that Engels' point here, that democracy, or bourgeois democracy as he's talking about in this context, is wholly valueless to the proletariat because these demands cannot be met, because they will simply be
watered down, crushed, or ignored, or crushed.
Or crushed. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at. Yeah. I'm never defending the fucking Labour Party.
Yeah.
Right, Joe, anything you want to say?
No. Just like on that point there, can you lot stop defending the Labour? People in general stop defending the Labour Party? Well, like I see a lot of Americans try and do that with Democratic Party or whatever. Try and push them left, or whatever. This is, why push them left? What? Like in the 1800s, they realized that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders isn't the solution. And they worked that out 150 years ago, and people are still doing it.
What's the phrase? They are the moderate wing of fascism, right?
Yeah.
And they will even murder communists in the street, as we saw in Germany when they murdered Rosa Luxemburg and sided with fascists, like physically. It's not just insane, is it?
Just for a very poignant, very recent example as well. Again, not to defend the Labour Party, but under Corbyn, it attracted many members of the youth and many more left-leaning members of society in general. And then we've seen a huge reaction to that with the election of Keir Starmer to that position following Corbyn's defeat. I'm not saying Corbyn would have implemented socialism or anything like that. What I'm saying is Starmer has proved this moderate wing of fascism when he's made his entire goal to be the destruction of the left of the Labour Party.
Yeah. I mean, they've even started I find it funny, they started proscribing Trotskyists like they're any sort of threat. Like, but that's how scared they are, right?
Yeah.
Start proscribing Trotskyists. I think it's funny because no communists have come to the Trotskyist aid as well. And why not? Because they've been the ones smearing us for so long, right? So are you going to come to their aid now?
Well, like
it's like that poem, isn't it, from World War II? First they came for the communists, then I did not speak up. First I came for next they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak up. And then but instead of the last line should be, and then they came for me, the Trotskyite. And
they came for our newspaper. And then they came for our newspaper, right?
Yeah. For fuck's sake.
Right, we've got up to point 18 there. We have hit 2 hours 17 on the stream. That's usually about right. If anybody got anything you want to add? And if you've got any questions in the chat, quick, get them in quick really now, right at the end, because we've got like 2 minutes left. So if you're quick, I'll get to you. But do you two want to say anything in regards to this text? Anything? Follow up? Whatever. Speak now or forever hold thine breath, as they say.
I just want to point out that Mass Casualty in the comments is a big fan of my Dengels statement by the looks of things. I was quite proud of that. I thought that was funny.
I think what's funny about Engels there is that you could post that on Twitter. This is how cursed Twitter is for political discourse, right? You could post those quotes on Twitter. You could get one of the prominent quote-unquote Dengists to post it, right? And they would get laughed at by all the ultras. But like the ultras are the ones that are supposed to stick to Marx and Engels religiously, right? Such is the discord on Twitter, the contradictions at play. You could do that and then be like, you do know that's an Engels quote, and they'll still argue down Engels.
Yeah, Engels was a Dengels. That's all it is.
Yeah. Monica, send them in the Discord chat, and Tom will see the memes you made. Joe, anything you want to say?
I'm gonna say I saw you did a little post on it, but rest in peace, Sean Locke. It's
Nice.
kind of, sad. But I
Yeah.
feel like a good way to end it is I'll quickly put a video in there. It's him on Sean Locke on Thatcher's about Thatcher, a little joke he did. It's quite funny. So I feel that's a good way.
Where have you put that? Oh, hold on.
Then gang.
Let me just let me post it into the stream chat and people can click on it. There you go. Click on that link on Twitter and watch a Sean Locke video. If you don't know who Sean Locke is, then he's a British comedian who passed away from cancer this week. Very funny guy, so you're in for a treat just watching his old stuff back. If that's the case. Right, Joe, thanks for filling in for Escher.
No worries.
I'm sure you can come back next week. We'll finish this up with Esh next week, right? Because I'm sure she'll have some good insight into this stuff. And we'll finish up the last... How many is there? The week after next. When I say next week, I mean next Thursday Theory, right? Where did we put the link for this? Let me see. How many's left? So we got up to what, 18 there?
Yeah.
18, so there's 19, 20, 21, 22. There's 24. And then there's a little bit of... 25, and then some footnotes. So we'll get it in one. Joe, you need to mute yourself. You're playing the video out on stream. Nice though. Right, you boys in the chat, keep quiet. Oh no, wait, hold on. I've forgotten to do our promo stuff. What am I like? Right. Don't forget, we've got tacky merch. Help us grow. Tom, you bought some today, didn't you? Be like Tom, buy some merch. If you're not that sort of merch minded and you're just like throwing money at nothing, then hold on, that's Artsy's one. But join our Patreon, which is just Patreon / Mango Press. But join Artsy's Patreon as well. She's with us painting every week. If you're a writer, get in touch with us on our website. We're trying to bump up our output of articles at the minute, and we need a little help. We're looking for people who write long ass 2,000 word essays on certain things. Like if you're really into Chinese Civil War and you want to write an article on it, do that. And we're also looking for people to write like a bit more casual stuff, facts about the USSR, whatever. So yeah, get in touch on our website. You'll get a nice reply back from Harrison, who's grilling you. Don't forget to check us out at mango-press.com. Our last article was yours, Tom. We're nearly getting as bad as you. So
I've got one in the works, but it's going to be a little while.
Nice. Harrison keeps telling us that we've got more coming soon, so I'll get onto him. So we've got some more.
You see, when you always just take the piss out of me about writing slowly. We need to take the piss equally as much about Harrison editing slowly, because I believe we've got about 5 in the pipeline. Yeah,
and Matray. And there's ones that they've just forgotten about that I'll get asked, and people think that we've forgotten about them, but we haven't. It's just we've got a queue. So yeah, we're looking for more people to help take part in that process, to help iron it out. So yeah, get in touch. Follow us on Twitter if you don't already. I know most of you do. There you go. Right, that's the promo stuff done. We are back next Friday, which is the 27th of August, with an episode on the DPRK that we've got a pre-recorded section with Matray, because Matray is in India and he can't make it this late because it's like 3 a.m. for him. But yeah, so look out for that next week. We're trying to get another guest on as well. We have a guest, but we're trying to get 2. All will be revealed. Right, see you next week, guys. Tom, Joe, do you want to say bye just before I turn this music up? No. Oh, here we go.
See you later, guys. See you later.
No, I don't want to say goodbye, but yeah, see ya.
Nice. See you in a bit, guys. You in the chat, keep quiet.